Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It sounds quite tepid, yeah? Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
That's more like it. That's the way we do it in Africa. Yes. Thank you very much for choosing to spend your morning with us. We really don't take it lightly. We appreciate your being here. I understand from my colleagues that over 1,200 people are also tuned in online. So we are very grateful to both the online audience and, of course, those of you here live. My name is Aloysius Uche Odu. I'm the director of the Africa Growth Initiative here at the Brookings Institution. It seems like an eternity of sorts when we assembled here last year to launch Foresight Africa 2023. Many of you will recall that at that time, most economists were predicting that the United States would be entering into a recession. In fact, most of the OECD countries, the global economy was headed to a recession. That was really the sort of discussion that was current at that time. And something changed because that really didn't happen. The US, as you know, battled inflation and many other countries, and that's really largely due to the very aggressive measures, high interest rates that the Federal Reserve, the ECB, and other central banks around the world to fight inflation. But high interest rates has helped to tame inflation here. But the other side of that coin is that high interest rate has proved to be very expensive for African countries. Because these countries were already facing multiple synchronized headwinds. You know, high inflation, severe currency depreciations, and of course, heavy debt burden. And interest rates basically it compounds the indebtedness of these countries. And when you look at the IMF and the World Bank debt sustainability framework, at some point we used to count how many people are not in debt, serious risk of debt distress. Now you look at the numbers. Most countries are either in high risk or in moderate risk of debt distress. And we've all read about Zambia in the papers, where, of course, in spite of all the efforts that that country has made, to take advantage of the G20's framework for debt relief, basically that has unraveled. We read about Ghana, we read about Ethiopia. So indebtedness is really very big deal on the continent right now, as countries are challenged in terms of settling their international financial obligations. But anyway, in spite of all that, the Economist Intelligence Unit in London predicts that in 2024, this year, Africa will be the world's second fastest growing region with 12 of the 20 fastest growing economies. That's clearly a reason for optimism. And indeed, the World Bank, the IMF, the African Development Bank, they all project growth rates in 2024 of around basically 3.8 to 4% in 2024. These are obviously interesting numbers that when you look at, in terms of per capita terms, how the continent is moving, population growth rates, and the debt burden and on high unemployment and food insecurity, then these sort of numbers of 3.8 to 4% is not really going to make a dent on poverty. And that's all happening around the same time when geopolitical tensions are rising, have continued unabated in the last few years. We all hear about, of course, the Israeli Hamas war, the Russia war in Ukraine, and of course the Houthis now attacking vessels in the Mediterranean Sea. These are all challenges that impact the global economy and, of course, impact countries on the African continent. And we also are now cognizant of a couple of own goals on the continent itself. And I'm not talking about the AFCON happening now in Cole's country in Cote d'Ivoire, right? I'm talking of own goals. I did not think that in 2023, 2024, we will be talking about military coups across the Sahel in the African continent. This is something we thought were relegated to the 80s and 70s, but coups are back in fashion, and those have implications for the continent. And of course, let's not forget climate change, which is wreaking havoc across the continent. You talk of the livelihoods, the livestock, the tourism revenues lost in the Horn of Africa. You talk of the unrelenting march of the Sahara Desert across southwards, and of course northern Mozambique and elsewhere where you have many of the climate ravages. So we're not here to paint a bleak image, because these are realities, and it's against that backdrop that we prepared this year's edition of Foresight Africa, which we are grateful to you for being here to help us launch this report today. What I'll do now before I introduce our esteemed panel is to really take a couple of highlights from the report when you actually start reading it. The first thing to note is that there are 77 authors in the report in front of you. That's a staggering number when you come to think about it. And it emphasizes one thing AGI does, the Africa Growth Initiative, does very well. And this is this commitment to, elevate African voices. 77 voices are in this report. And these include senior policymakers, finance ministers, central bank governors, captains of industry, heads of foundation, youths and scholars. That all you find them expressing themselves in this particular report. And of course, I'm also very, very grateful to all our contributors, but I want to also emphasize that it takes a village to pull through something like this. And the AGI team, Alex is here, Sakina, I believe, is online, Landry is here, Nicole is online in Uganda, Chris is online, and of course our communications team, headed by Esther. I see Izzy here and Janine. These guys absolutely work flat out to pull off something like this. And I think on their behalf and on behalf of our contributors, I'd like you to give them a round of applause, please. Thank you. Now, the second thing I'd like to call your attention when you look at this report is that we take inclusion very, very seriously in the Africa Growth Initiative. Nearly half of the authors in this report are women, and that's a trend we have continued since we made gender a chapter of our flagship report. And of course, there's a chapter devoted to gender again, because the quest for equality, as you will all agree, remains an unfinished business, not just in Africa, but here at home in the United States. There's another aspect of inclusion that we don't talk about much that you will find in this report, and that's the inclusion of Africa's many, many language groups. The continent we know has the Francophone group. I mean, where would we be without Landry? The continent has the Anglophone group, and we don't often hear of voices from the Lusophone group, the Portuguese-speaking countries. Over the years, we have really emphasized the Anglophone and Lusophone. This year, I'm really, really delighted that we have a couple of senior policymakers who have contributed from the Lusophone group. In particular, I'd like to call your attention to the piece by the finance minister of Angola, a country that's one of Africa's heavyweight, Honorable Vera de Souza, who shared with us some of the challenges they themselves are facing in terms of the multiple headwinds that Angola faces. I'd also like to call your attention to a piece by the Blue Economy Minister of Cape Verde, Honorable Vincent Abroa. Now let me digress a little bit here on Cape Verde, an impressive country in terms of the African narrative. Cape Verde beat Ghana, Cape Verde beat Mozambique, and Cape Verde drew with mighty Egypt in Cote d'Ivoire. But that's not why I want to focus on Cape Verde. These are incredible, completely incredible accomplishments. When you think of a country with 500,000 people, or just over, between basically the continent of Africa and Massachusetts, right? And a couple of islands. So this is amazing. You will recall that as recently as 1980, the GDP per capita of Cape Verde really was $500. GDP per income per head. This was one of the poorest countries. And this country was losing fresh water, and poverty was running rife. Fast forward to today. The income per head in Cape Verde is over 3,500, higher than many, many countries on the continent. It's not only punching above its weight as a giant killer in the AFCON, it's also punching above its weight when it comes to climate change in terms of the impact and their voices to be heard in what they're doing on the blue economy in terms of small island states. So it never ceases to amaze me. In fact, I think Henry IV, Shakespeare said, I think of Africa and of its golden joys. And Cape Verde is one of those surprises that we always learn each day in terms of what's happening on the African continent. The other thing I would like to call your attention to is that we have continued the deliberate constituency building and partnerships in AGI. We have about 27 partners across the African continent now. We now have expanded our partners to East Asia, where in Singapore we have a contribution of Dr. Amit Jain, who you read in the paper, who's the director of the Center for African Studies at Nanyang Business School in Singapore, who really wrote a brilliant book on Nigeria recently, and went to Nigeria to launch it. And in the context of that, he's helped us by contributing a piece to this year's Foresight. So those are some of the things that I thought you should watch out for when you read the report. And of course, there are, as you see, 7 chapters in the report. The first chapter deals very briefly with AGI's bread and butter development financing. And here you see Africa's heavyweights, Nigeria, Angola, Ethiopia, and Kenya. These are finance ministers, central bank governors. How are they struggling? How are they against all the odds of the global headwinds that many countries face? You find most of that in this chapter. On climate change, which is the second chapter, 2023 has gone down in history as the hottest year on the planet, as all of you know. 2023 was also a year of a lot of convening. We had the COP28, we had the Nairobi summit, we had the New York, etc., etc. But the one thing Africans desperately wanted to have was climate financing. The continent suffers the most of climate change. The continent is one of the lungs of the world. If you think of what is happening, the carbon sink in the Congo Basin. And don't forget a piece here on the Okavango River Basin where a lot of carbon is sequestrated as well. And yet when it comes to climate financing, Africa we still have a lot of way to go. There's a chapter on entrepreneurship and job creation, in economic speak, structural transformation, as my boss here, Cole, would say, And here you will see many, many, many African youths and young people who are really, against all the odds, forming their own enterprises in terms of to create jobs for others. And we have some Access Bank, for example, which has branches across the whole continent, talking about what they're doing to boost small and medium-scale enterprises across the continent. And there's also a very, very brilliant essay on family-owned enterprises and how these are incubators, if you like, of entrepreneurship in Africa. A chapter on digital economy, Landry himself here, with Professor Harun Borat of Cape Town, who penned the framing essay basically on the digital divide and what is being done about it. There is a chapter on trade and regional integration since the African Continental Free Trade Area, trying to bring us up to date as to what the challenges and the opportunities therein lie. We talked about gender already, and then of course the own goal, the governance issues, which became very dominant in the past couple of months. So these are what we in AGI consider in 2024 as the top priorities. I'm sure other people may have what they consider their own priorities, but these are the ones we have decided to focus on for you this year. So to shed light on these priorities, I am absolutely delighted that we're able to assemble such a brilliant team of panelists that you see in front of you here. I would like you to please give them a round of applause. Okay, on today's panel, you'll see we have, I'm particularly happy to welcome our colleague Kalpana. Kalpana Kocha is the Director of Development Policy and Finance from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which provides critical funding to Brookings. Our work is not possible without the contributions of our philanthropic partners, and we are glad she's here to lend her expertise as well. I would like to reiterate, though, that Brookings' commitment to independence and underscores that the views expressed here today by all our panelists are those of the speakers. Also on the panel is Ambassador J. Peter Fang, who's a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. We have my sister over there, Yaye. I have to differentiate between the two. We have two Zanabos here. Yaye Senabu Sako, who's the Director of Strategy and Operations at the World Bank, at the Office of the Managing Directors at the World Bank Group. We also have my brother here, Landre, Senior Fellow with us at AGI and Global Economy, and of course, my sister from next door, Zainab Usman, Senior Fellow and Director of the Africa Program at Carnegie. So here's, first of all, welcome to all of you. Okay. A couple of housekeeping rules. The panelists have agreed 2 minutes each, what they consider their own top priority for the African continent this year and why. So we'll go around in the order they are seated in a minute. And we also do have some specific individual questions that I'll pose to each of the panelists. And then we have some audience questions from you and those online. And by the way, those online who wish to tweet and send in more questions, please, it's events@brookings.edu, or those on Twitter or X, is at Brookings Global #Foresight 2024. So let's get started, ladies and gentlemen. 2 minutes each, starting from you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Aloysius. Can you hear me all?
Yeah.
And congratulations on the publication of the Foresight Africa report. This is truly a flagship report for the AGI, and I really admire all of the work that went into coordinating 77 authors and reviewing dozens of chapters. So as your colleague from next door, I know what goes on behind the scenes to do the reviewing and the editing, so well done to the entire team.
Thank you.
What is the top priority for Africa, or maybe African countries in 2024? I would say it should be the ability to navigate a very turbulent global trade environment. The ability or the failure to do so is going to have significant cascading impacts on these countries' trade balance, their fiscal position, and their ability to achieve the broader economic development objectives that they have, whether it's industrialization, structural transformation, however which way you want to define that. Why is the global trade environment turbulent, or in what ways is it turbulent? I want to mention, there are so many dimensions to this, but I want to mention maybe 3 things. The first is that there are trade wars among the global powers, and these trade wars are starting to have spillover impacts. So notably, we know that the US and China are not really seen eye to eye with respect to trade in certain industries, across a range of industries, product lines, and even services. With China, tech platforms, for example, just using one example, have not really been able to access the Chinese market, right? Certain types of tech platforms. But also in the US, there are tariffs that have been put up for, again, specific product lines, you know, whether you think of one basic example, you know, if you want to buy a mobile phone today, you go to whatever store it is here. I don't want to mention any store. You're not going to see any Chinese mobile phone. So across the board, you know, you're seeing that the US and China are not really seeing eye to eye with respect to trade. The EU and China, increasingly, those tensions are emerging, especially with respect to electric vehicles, renewable energy technologies, whether it's solar panels, wind turbines, again, products that China has a huge market share. So the war in Ukraine, the sanctions placed on Russia have really reorganized global energy markets. So there's that, but also within the global south, low and middle income countries, they are also putting in place their own trade barriers, export bans in particular. We saw, bans placed on the export of essential food commodities in India, for example, Indonesia as well, Southeast Asia. And then just broadly, we're seeing the widespread use of subsidies to support domestic industries across a whole range of countries. But the fundamental issue, I think, is that the World Trade Organization is just really not able to play its role in perhaps making sure that we're not having this race to the bottom with respect to the implementation of various kinds of debilitating subsidies. Not that all subsidies are bad, because it's dispute settlement system is really more or less moribund. So there is that, and it is not very clear to me that a lot of African countries understand that the global trading environment is different today than it was in 2018 and that it was in 2010. Some countries get it, many don't. So this is absolutely essential because they need to understand that this turbulent global trading environment means that their ability to access markets for exports is changing. I want to give one crucial example here. Even with respect to the export of something, unprocessed crude oil, the markets have shifted within the last, 2-3 years. It used to be that China was a major consumer of African crude oil. Increasingly, China is sourcing its crude oil supplies from the GCC countries. This has happened within the last 2-3 years. Then increasingly from Russia. But again, when you talk to some African policymakers, they don't get it. And then the impact also on the trade balance and the ability to earn foreign exchange, which then goes back to the point you made earlier about pressures on the currencies of African countries. When you look at the numbers, on average, African countries have depreciated by about, an average of 16 to 20%. Between 2022 to date. And then the fiscal balance, and then obviously the ability to do investments, public investments in infrastructure and in human capital. So I think this is, for me, the essential thing that African countries need to prioritize.
I think we all have an obligation to make sure our countries do get it because the trading environment is so turbulent out there. Landry.
Thank you very much and congratulations for an incredible foresight.
Yeah, thanks.
So hello everyone. So I think the top priority for me is really the ability of African countries, but also for global partners to bridge the gap between policy intentions and implementation outcomes. Even if the policy already developed now are successfully implemented, the outcome that we'll have for the continent will just be incredibly phenomenal. I'm not even speaking about improving the policies. Yes, policies need to be improved. But beyond that, the one already existing should be successfully implemented. And let me just take some illustration. One, related to women, a full inclusion of women in the workforce can increase the GDP or economic output from 2% to almost 50% depending on the countries. Another key point here, between 2015 and 2035, about 450 million young people will reach the working age, and only about 25% of those young people are supposed to have quality jobs. By the end of the century, as you know, Africa will represent about 40% of the global population. So really bridging that gap between the policy intention and the implementation outcome will make a monumental difference. I will not be mentioning key priority and bridging the gap between intention and implementation without highlighting the African Continental Free Trade Area. I just came back from Davos. An action plan for global business and investment in Africa was launched with the head of state and head of government and CEO of Global Multinational. So it will also be important to accelerate the implementation of the AFCFTA. And in order to achieve these goals, technology, innovation, digital technology, as well as the one associated with the fourth industrial revolution and governance will play a monumental role. I can further expand. I speak often for a week when I deliver some session, but I think I'll stop here in the interest of time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kalpana, your 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, and good morning. Just before I get to the question, I really wanted to say I'm delighted to be here for the launch of this Foresight Africa report. As Aloysius said in the beginning, the Gates Foundation has partnered closely with AGI since its inception, funded the development of this report for many years. And one of the things that I really liked about the report is, in addition to its rigor, its accessibility, the way it's unusually accessible, notwithstanding the fact that if you wanted to really get the rigor underneath it, you could get that too, which is very useful for those of us who not only work with, key interlocutors and ministers and so on in government, but also with the advocacy ecosystem. The other thing I like about it is the diversity of authors, which I know have really set a priority on. It's incomparable, and you just don't get the diversity of voices that show up in this report. It's critical to shaping the debate on the continent, and it's also a way to project African priorities and perspectives. So kudos really to everyone who's involved in this. It's really an outstanding piece. Now on the priority, one priority, I think I'm echoing a couple of things that you all are saying. For me, this is the moment for African countries to take a good, hard look at their development model, their institutions, and lay out a clear vision for their clear vision for the way forward. Homegrown, long-term, sustained, transparent, accountable, with people at the center. I mean, that really has to be the vision, and this is not something that costs money. So I know we're going to talk about development finance. That is my role throughout my career, but this doesn't cost money. This takes commitment, and it gives you an opportunity, actually through trade, Landry mentioned digital, implementing reusable, shareable, interoperable digital solutions, which by the way, the foundation has been laid mostly in developing countries. India being one of them, but not the only one. Brazil, in many other countries have started to do it. This is an opportunity for Africa to actually leapfrog. I know that people have said that's an overused term, but I think there are real opportunities here. So, laying out the vision, the African vision, or maybe that's too much to ask since it's a continent, but African countries' vision, with people at the center. For all the reasons that you said, these are the global workforce of the future, and being very mindful about the use of digital, not only for efficiency to get services to people, but also to project transparency, accountability, and ultimately, benefit the people to whom everyone owes. And I wanted to say, this is not only the global the workforce in Africa, but the global workforce. Just, we can talk about aging when we come to that, but
Great.
yes.
Great. Thank you.
Aloysius.
Thank you very much, Kalpana. Zainabu, over to you.
So first of all, what a pleasure to be here today with all of you.
Yeah,
And
yes.
second, as soon as it was hot off the press, I read it very quickly. Now I'm going to read it again with the hard copy.
Thank
so
you.
I invite all of you to do the same. So on the question, I started teaching African economics this week. And in front of my class, I was thinking, what am I going to tell them about the priorities for Africa?
Yeah.
And I've been traveling in the past 6 months to Africa more than I have done in the past year. From the west to Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Morocco, all the way to the east, Ethiopia, Sudan, Tanzania, Chad. And sometimes when you see what is happening in the Sahel, you can be very sad. And for this new class, for me, it was really important to have a story that was also about hope, about optimism, but eyes wide open optimism. So 3 things came. The first thing relates to the point you made, Aloysius, about growth. Actually, African economies are leading world growth. This is amazing. It's been so long that we haven't heard about this story. But what made me really hopeful wasn't that. It was the fact that this time, it was not the resource-rich countries that were leading it. It wasn't your Angola. It wasn't your Nigeria. No, it was the non-resource-rich countries that were leading it. It was your Uganda and Kenya. It was your Tanzania on the back of what? Business environment, business climate. That's the Africa we want. That's the story we want to tell.
Yeah.
So I was really excited about that. But while I was excited, I was also really looking at the per capita income story, where what you see is really meager increase, 1.2, 1.5%, which means that you still have about 400 million extreme poor living in Africa, which is 2/3 of the global poor.
Yeah.
That's not something that is exciting.
No.
The other thing is when you look at this growth outlook, what you realize is that the downside risks are enormous. You look at what's happening in terms of uncertainty in the global world. You look at political violence. You look at conflict. And so you cannot really rest on your laurels. So I was like, okay, I'm excited, but we can do much better.
Yeah.
The second point was really about jobs. And what you see is that for every 10 million Africans who come to the job market every year, only 3 million of them will find formal jobs. And the rest will go to informality or unemployment. And that is a problem. Where will those jobs will come? And then you have 3 stories. The story of minerals. If you look at, for instance, the mineral that the world will need for its energy transition, they will come from Africa. But of those minerals, let's take, for instance, cobalt. 2/3 of the global cobalt is mined in the DRC, but 70% is transformed in China.
Yeah.
Imagine if that was transformed in Africa, those would be jobs. Landry mentioned the Africa Continental Free Trade, 18 million jobs. That is an opportunity to close that gap. And you think about energy. I really believe that Africa can lead on renewable energy, and those are also jobs. So if you look at all of this, you're like, okay, that's one. Last point is about youth. Many of my fellow panelists mentioned the fact that if you look at the global workforce of the future, actually, the World Bank made a study, and what they find is that from 2030 to 2050, 90% of the growth in the workforce of the world will come from Africa. So what do you want? You want them educated, you want them skilled, and you want them connected. But there is an opportunity. There's an opportunity because if about 80% of the population has some sort of access to 3G, only 22% of those 3G have access to mobile service, which we know are critical for productivity and really for doing well. So again, hopeful, but at the same time, eyes wide open optimism. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Aloysius, and congratulations to you and the AGI team for another stellar report, and which I commend to everyone to read, and the diversity of authors you mentioned, and the perspectives in there are very, very rich and a lot of food for thought. The advantage of being the last to speak is I can just say ditto, and but my colleagues have already brought issues. My top priority for Africa for 2024 and ensuing years is to be strategic. Africa has a unique moment in history right now. Just take this week, for example, the week we're in. We have the United States Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, in Africa, traveling. He's wrapping up in Angola right now. This weekend in Rome, 20 plus African heads of state and government are gathering with guests of Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister, for a summit. This is the year that Italy chairs the G7. They're pushing forward a plan to reset Italy's relationships with the continent, with the Piano Mattei. So all these things, a geopolitical moment is there. Attention is focused. My sister just mentioned the minerals and the energy transition. There's no energy transition without Africa. And it's not just the rare minerals, the cobalt that was mentioned, but even more common minerals, copper. We can't electrify without copper wire. We haven't discovered an alternative to copper yet. And yet, and this year alone, DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is going to become the second largest producer. So all sorts of opportunities there. Energy transition. Demographics has been mentioned. We all know the statistics. 1 in 4 workers in the world is going to be an African by mid-century. So all sorts of opportunities. But will those opportunities be seized? And in order for them to be seized, it's critical to have a strategic vision. And this is incumbent on leaders across not just government, but the business, not just to go to the meetings that we all traipse off to, or the summits. You can spend a whole year doing that alone, but to actually deliver with real, concrete, actionable plans. Because for Africa to benefit from all this, what does it need? Energy. You can't transform minerals without energy. You cannot have develop human capital without energy, and you need infrastructure to connect, and both of which need finance, which we can talk about. But in order to have any of those three, you have to have a strategic vision beyond the words, beyond the declarations and plans, to have a strategic vision. And that's the key, is to develop that strategic vision. Otherwise, and it has to be actionable. Otherwise, as one wise mentor once told me, vision without resources and a plan is a delusion. And I think that's where we're at. So that's my top priorities, a strategic approach to the opportunity.
Great, thank you. Thank you very, very much. I think on that question alone, we have already seen the parallels to aspects of the chapters in this year's report. Peter, let's stick with you this time round on US-Africa policy. Right? You just returned earlier this week from a trip to several African countries where you met with top government officials, and of course you're also traveling again next week from what you shared. In the process, I understand that you crossed paths with several senior US officials and undoubtedly compared notes. So how do you see prospects for the type of new paradigm promised by President Biden at the US-Africa Summit that was held in December last year?
Well, I think to give the administration its due, the promise of visits, of engagements is unparalleled. The number of cabinet-level visits, the high-level delegations. I literally was running across people, some of it intentionally, some of it was literally at breakfast at the hotel throughout my trip. So I give them a lot of credit for that. But the key is to also, if I put it as a priority for African countries to develop a strategic approach, it's also incumbent upon the US to do the same. Now, I give a lot of credit to the development of very focused, targeted engagements. For example, the Lobito Corridor, which Secretary Blinken is celebrating this week, a connective tissue for Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zambia, and potentially beyond. But it's not just transport, but it's also telecommunications, the digital aspect. It's also food security. It's also trade. There are, and it's not my place to jump the administration, but there are also plans in the offing for a second corridor and others in Africa. We launched this year as part of the PGI process in the G7. So that's ongoing. So that type of focus engagement is critical. to delivering on the promises. Otherwise, it's a lot of social calls, but without delivery. But I give them credit for moving forward, and I think that's an opportunity to build on. And I like the inclusiveness of it. The Libya Accord includes not just the African countries involved in the U.S., but also the African Development Bank, and also the European Union. So it's all hands on deck, and I think that's the approach that Africa needs.
Great, thank you very much. I was just wondering, Landry, do you have anything to add to what Peter just said before we move on to the next question? Yeah.
No, I do agree, Peter, about the continued engagement at the high level, which is extremely important. And whether here at the Brookings Institution with the VP, Brahima Koulibaly, and you, and many of us here on the panel have been engaging with the administration to really provide options for better outcome. Now, probably one of the things which should be accelerated, and I think I mentioned that in my opening remark, is how do we accelerate the implementation of the initiatives which are already adopted.
Right.
They are great, they're extraordinary, but we need to reduce the gap between those wonderful initiatives and the actual implementation, including in regard to the support for the African Continental Free Trade Area, and also for AGOA, which staying in a, of course, many of the commitments were already made, but as long as things are not definitive, that will have an impact on the ability of investors and of traders, of businesses to achieve their potential at the fullest.
Right, thank you very much. Zainabu, let me turn to you on debt, right? You know, many African countries, as we mentioned in the report, and as I alluded at the beginning, the World Bank's and the IMF's debt sustainability framework, you know, is replete with challenges on the debt front. Zambia, we talked about its restructuring, Ethiopia in default, and Ghana on its way now to a debt deal. So apart from sounding the alarm bells about Africa's debt, what exactly is the World Bank doing to address the debt problem?
No, first of all, I think that the big point is that this debt problem has been long into the making. Yeah. Since 2012, debt has almost doubled. Actually, it has more than doubled from about 29% in 2012. As of now, we are at over 60%. So it's really going there. And you have many factors that are affecting why debt has ballooned so much. Part of it has to do with the fact that we had the crisis in commodity prices around 2014, and many of the countries also started accessing basically markets, issuing bonds when global financial conditions were looser. And all of that has resulted also in this accumulation at a time where growth was pretty low, fiscal deficit were high, but development needs were back. I think that you have to admit that they have to respond to the development needs. That has been always the trifecta for a government, having the need to provide to this population that is growing very fast education, health, basic infrastructure, and ways basically to provide jobs while at the same time not getting the revenue base to do it. That's the dilemma. The other thing that is quite scary is what they call the debt service interest over revenue. That has grown so much. It's over 30%, which means that if you are a government, you have very little left to get school, to get education, at a time where your population is growing so fast that by the time you build the school, you have more people coming. So that has been long in the making. So I mentioned the common framework countries. Out of the 4 common framework, I've been to Chad, to Ethiopia, and to Ghana. Beyond how protracted the process has been, we forget that it's getting better. It took more than 2 years to Zambia. It took a year to Ghana. This week, we went to our board to provide a development policy loan to Ghana, where you have reforms that are helping basically the country deal with some of the bottlenecks to growth, like energy and other regulation. So we're doing a lot of that. We are also supporting the Global Debt Roundtable and the conversation around how do countries get together and how do we facilitate that coordination. Another thing that we are doing is really, if you take all those 4 countries, in the past 3 years, the World Bank has provided almost $10 billion, over $9 billion. And country, what they need is liquidity. Because, for instance, it was very interesting to go to Ethiopia and we talk about all this crisis, we talk about the default. Guess what? That country is growing. It is growing. They know how to grow. They have lots of other problems, but they know how to grow. So whenever we look at the situation, there's this, okay, is it the glass half full or half empty? Yeah. It's not a solvency. You do have liquidity issue. So we are working more and more to think about how do we provide liquidity? How do we become more innovative and more nimble to plug those holes while it's coming? But a critical issue that we will need at least to get our handle on because it is here to stay.
Yeah, okay, right. Sticking to development finance, and Zainab, let me turn to you. Skip my brother for a moment. At a time of such increased soft power competition as we're witnessing, right? The U.S. and Africa Summit of December 2022. Actually, that summit raised a great deal of expectations, right, about increased U.S. investments in Africa. So what needs to be done to attract more U.S. investments to bridge the infrastructure gap, since that's really one area that Africans find difficult in attracting funding?
A couple of things there to unpack. One, the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit and the buzz around that, as well as promises made, initiatives announced. I think a total of $55 billion or so worth of initiatives, some new, some kind of pre-existing. So that, and then, how to attract or grow U.S. investments in Africa. And then infrastructure. I think they're kind of separate, but they're related. So starting with the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, it was indeed, very kind of eventful. DC here was, filled with a lot of people, lots of great sessions, huge turnout. But very importantly, I think a lot of us working in the space, as well as African policymakers, were very happy with the reception they got from the U.S., the highest levels of the U.S. government, which is really something that had not happened previously, which is really the truth. You would often get officials who are not probably on the same level with their counterparts in Africa receiving high-level African dignitaries. So that was an important, I think, achievement on the part of the Biden administration. And then some of the initiatives that were announced sounded very interesting and promising. Now, the follow-through, I think Landry has already kind of mentioned that, as well as Ambassador Pham. That is something that still needs to happen, whether it's a follow-through with respect to President Biden's own visit to the continent, even though Secretary Yellen, Secretary Blinken, and a number of others in the cabinet have visited the continent. So that follow-through, we need to see more of that. Of course, the Lobito Corridor infrastructure project connecting 3 countries is one big achievement, but the truth is we need 10 Lobito corridors in Africa, not just one. The issue of U.S. investments, I think we can devote an entire week talking about that. It's always interesting, depending on who you talk to, you hear different things. You talk to some investors, some in the private sector. If you talk to the government relations people, they will tell you, oh, yes, we care about Africa. This is the next big thing. If you talk to people in headquarters, whether it's, somewhere in New York or elsewhere, it's like, I don't know, Africa, we're more focused on Europe than, parts of Asia. This really is the honest truth. Beyond, certain industries and sectors, whether it's, oil and gas, hello. When you look at the FDI numbers, the stock of US FDI from the US from US companies to Africa, the bulk of it is in extractive industries, oil and gas in particular. That's the reality. So it really depends on who you talk to, but there needs to be more interest from US investors in Africa, and there are things that can be done. We can draw examples from other parts of the world, whether it's doing more trade shows and trade fairs, or investor shows, road shows, not just in DC and New York, by the way, going to like, you know, different US states where the companies that are, you know, in agriculture or whatever sector or industry are going there, introducing Africa to them. And in fact, working with the states as well. And some of the states here, you know, whether it's the state of Virginia, California, a number of others are coming up with Africa strategies because they want to encourage the private sector there to engage with Africa. So that is something concrete and tangible that can be done. Now, the issue of infrastructure, just to kind of round things up, I do think, yes, the US can and should do more in infrastructure. Maybe my politically incorrect opinion is I don't think it's the, you know, when you think in terms of comparative advantage of the US building infrastructure, I don't know. Maybe there are other things that can be done with respect to higher education investments. US universities are really the top-ranking universities in the world. How do we build partnerships with local African institutions, whether it's in terms of pharmaceuticals, in particular, you know, US pharmaceutical companies are the top in the world. African countries need to scale up their pharmaceutical capacity, whether it's the value chains or, you know, vaccine manufacturing, medicines, etc. So maybe we need to do like a sector-by-sector analysis. I don't know if building rail infrastructure, I mean, the Lobito corridor is great. We need more of that, but yeah, let's just think through some of these things carefully.
Great. Andre, you have
on this question, excellent point, Zainab. So one of the things that we have done with the World Economic Forum Regional Action Group for Africa, and which I think could be a model, used as a model for the US, is a private sector-led action plan. Because when you speak about US-Africa relation, we typically speak about what will the US government do, or why should African government do. But we should focus on what should corporations, private corporations, multinationals or SMEs, American SMEs, what should they do to unlock that potential? And at Davos, the action plan which was released was a coordinated effort by the private sector where each of the corporation, including Coca-Cola, for example, committed to a specific activities within a specific timeline and on which they will report. So that's a little bit a shift of mindset from only focusing on government activities to bringing back much more of the private sector. And I think the Corporate Council on Africa here could, for example, partner with think tanks such as the Brookings Institution and other players to really help convene and frame this conversation.
I mean, these are all excellent points, and I think, Zana, your point is well taken about U.S. government physically building infrastructure, not necessarily its comparative advantage. But if you think of the $55 billion that was committed, and $5 billion of the 55 set aside, basically as grant funding, which is what is desperately needed, to de-risk infrastructure projects across the continent. I mean, Kwame Nkrumah, when he was president of Ghana, at the formation of the AU, those days OAU, he envisaged, you know, railway lines, roads and bridges from Cape Town to Cairo, from, you know, Mombasa to Dakar, you know, those visions, we still haven't realized them. So the idea of setting aside $5 billion to de-risk these cross-border infrastructure projects, and then that opens up the opportunities for those who know how to do this, i.e., as Landry mentioned, U.S. private entities to actually get involved in there. So those sort of tangible responses would be very, very useful. But as you said at the very beginning, it's a subject we can spend a whole week dwelling on. Let me turn to you, Kalpana, because there are a couple of replenishment meetings in prospect soon. You have the IDA replenishment at the 21. And of course, in the African Development Bank, the African Development Fund has its replenishment also the 16th midterm, and then the actual 17th will kick off. This is all happening at a time when African countries are now at a point where growth prospects, as we just talked about, have dimmed for some countries, and poverty is a big deal. At the same time, debt is becoming unsustainable across the board. Climate financing needs are just enormous, right? And faced with challenges of their own, the very donor countries we rely on for the replenishment, they also have a diminished appetite for grants and concessional financing, which is what is desperately needed in low-income Africa and fragile states. So under these sort of circumstances, how is the Gates Foundation, positioning itself for the forthcoming replenishments, and what will success look like for you guys?
Great, thank you so much. For those, I don't really have to say it, but let me just say it anyway. IDA, the International Development Organization, which is, can I just say, not a particularly inspiring name. I know it was named a long time ago, but I wish, anyway, when replenishment season is not the one that necessarily, inspires a lot of attention. But let me just say the facts of the matter are, it is the largest provider of external financing to low-income countries, has been since it was created. Yeah. It has annual commitments of $30 billion, mostly in grants or very, very, very concessional loans. We're talking 38, 40-year loans with repayment grace periods of a long time at virtually zero interest rates. So, yes, other sources of financing have dried up. Donors' appetite has gone down. Incidentally, not necessarily for increasing ODA. Okay. That if you look at the OECD DAC numbers, ODA has gone up a lot, been mostly to Ukraine and to
near Africa, right?
Yes. So when we talk about donor appetite, I think it's very important to make a distinction. Yeah. Donor appetite in some places is hale and hearty, but not necessarily to where it was going before or where it should go. China, for another set of reasons, is also now very low net inflows into Africa after a period of very high inflows. Private capital markets, countries are essentially locked out. We can talk about that if necessary. And IDA really stepped up in the last, since the pandemic, has really stepped up. Remember that IDA also was put in place with the anticipation that countries would so-called graduate out of IDA, and that this was that not only has stalled, it's actually reversed. You've had one country becoming IDA eligible again. Yeah. So just to keep that in mind, and IDA really did step up. For this, and against that background, remember, it's not just the donor appetite for the kind of aid that used to take place has diminished. Donor contributions to IDA have remained constant over the last 3 or 4 replenishments at around $23 billion in nominal terms, so which means a real decline. So I think the bank hasn't yet indicated how much it's going to ask of its donors. The president, Alibanga, in Zanzibar during the midterm review indicated that a lot of money will have to come from donors. We've heard numbers ranging from a 20% increase by donors for IDA 21. Other calculations suggest actually if IDA is to remain at 93 billion, which was what they managed to do. Remember, and the beauty of IDA is not only do they take donors' money, but they also are able to leverage it in the capital markets, and therefore every dollar is something like $4, as Aki likes to say, Nishio. But so it's if IDA is to remain at the 93, there are estimates that say donor contributions should go up by 50%. So not 23 billion, but more like 37 billion. Yeah. The realism of that is questionable. So where does the Gates Foundation come in? We don't contribute. We're a our CEO likes to say we're not a shareholder, but an important stakeholder. We currently have $1 billion in support to the World Bank through various trust funds. So, but we're not a member, and of course we don't participate in governance, neither should we. But we rely on the bank as a critical partner to provide sort of the scaffolding, the policy scaffolding for the things that the Gates Foundation is interested in. Usually it's around health, but also agriculture, livelihoods for smallholder farmers, and so on and so forth. So for us, it's an absolutely critical initiative, and we throw our advocacy weight behind it. We will be, for those of you who might have seen, Mark Sussman, our CEO, wrote an op-ed recently on IDA. We'll continue to keep up that drumbeat. But one of the things that we want to really emphasize is that the replenishment of IDA this year and the African Development Fund next year will serve as an important test of the global financial system. This is a theme that we want to keep emphasizing. For all the talk about being worried about what's going on in low-income countries, and particularly in Africa, we are going to emphasize that these are the instruments that donors need to step up and fund, and fund not at the levels that they were doing before, but at much higher levels. So all the talk about reforms of the global financial architecture, we are going to emphasize that this is going to be a true indication of you putting your money where your mouth is. Donors.
Sure. Thank you very much. I see Zainabu nodding. Anytime she mentioned IDA, she was pointing to you. Do you have a...
I have to say, you're my favorite person, Anna. I just have to say it, because if I talk about IDA being from the World Bank,
it's
different. It's better that she does it. In terms of your word about what's the ambition,
yes,
the largest IDA ever.
That's what I said.
That's
the largest IDA ever, because the world needs it, Africa needs it. I think that's really the ambition right now, and that's what we are all working really hard. Ajay in Zanzibar, the philanthropists, everybody, because it's really critical that we come forward for Africa.
Sure. And so, since I have a stake in both the IDA and in the African Development Fund, I would say we also need the largest replenishment ever for the ADF. Thank you very much. Landry, you mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Area a couple of times. One of the essays in this year's Foresight by Andrew Mould and Francis Mangeni reminded us that regional agreements of this kind take time. In fact, as a reference point, the European Union took 11 years before it established its customs union, and a further 25 years before it established a single market. With that in mind, how do you assess the progress to date since the launching of the African Continental Free Trade Area?
That's a very important question. I was just engaging with Secretary General Wamkele at Davos last week, and this was part of the conversation on the progress of the AFCFTA. So just to put things in context, this AFCFTA was signed in 2018. A sufficient number of countries ratified in 2019. Was supposed to be officially launched in 2020, but due to the pandemic, was launched on the 1st of January 2021. So it is the second largest world, let's say, trade organization after the WTO per number of countries. So the velocity, it is difficult to believe that such a large agreement will be implemented with such a fast speed. Now, having said that, you have areas where great achievements could be told, and other areas for improvement. So one of the key areas, I think, now, so if I ask a question, do you think that some countries are currently trading under the AFCFTA or not? Is it just a framework, or do you think that countries are already trading? Some are trading. We think that they are not trading. Okay. So under the Guided Trade Initiative, which is a specific tool created by the AFCFTA to have a specific number of countries starting trading with one another, including Ghana, Cameroon, among other. So many countries have started trading from an experimental perspective. And given the success of the first phase, they plan to expand to 29, when the official number that I had was 29, but during the AFCFTA, at Davos, the Secretary General said 40-something. So, but let's say a few dozens of countries, the system will be generalized to those countries. So in other words, countries can now trade under the African continental free trade area. This is one specific achievement. Another one, as a matter of fact, some of the partnerships already mentioned, the AFCFTA with the World Economic Forum, they have partnered. Last year at Davos 2023, they launched the private sector strategy for global businesses to engage with Africa. This year was the action plan, and CEO were very excited to see how we shifted from strategy to action plan, and some are already excited of sharing the outcome of the action plan in 2025. So that's another point. The AFCFTA has also launched a AFCFTA Business Forum. So as you know, to trade, you need to produce. You need to unlock the manufactural potential, industrial development among other, and be connected. So the inaugural AFCFTA Business Forum was this year in April in South Africa, and the next one will be by the end of this year. In fact, the initial one was in April 2023 in South Africa, and the next one will be by October or so in 2024. So that's another illustration. Let me just add a few one. We have the AFCFTA Adjustment Fund, which was launched in collaboration with Afreximbank. As we know, not all the African countries have the same capacity when it comes to trade. So the idea is to provide capacity to some of those countries or support some specific areas, especially the country which may benefit from the special and differential treatments. And there too, the commitment, the funding commitment is already about $1 billion, but in the next 4 to 6 years, they hope to have a commitment which could reach or exceed $10 billion. So you have been involved, and I think that was already discussed even here at Brookings, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System. So again, in partnership with the Afreximbank. As a matter of fact, African countries lose more than $5 billion in trading with one another using a different currency. So with PAPS, so allow for African countries to deal with their own currencies. Of course, I can expand additional points, including protocols where progress has been made, but also the tariff book of the AFCFTA. But I'll be happy to further expand during the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Aaron. I think the audience has been so wonderfully patient. Before another round of questions, I just want to check with our colleagues here with the mic, if we can take very quickly 3 questions from the audience and come back to them again. So you have hands, I think you had your hands up first. Okay, Alex has, perhaps you can already give in this front line, and then we'll take one from here. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
I think the mic is, okay, so, hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I think the mic is off, huh? Good morning.
Yeah, morning.
Good morning.
My name is Arthur Asimwe, and I work at the Rwanda Embassy here in DC.
Yeah.
Let me just start by reading a tweet that has been issued this morning by the State Department, quoting Secretary Blinken. And he says, "We see America's future and Africa's future as joined. Our peoples are joined. prosperity and success in the future is linked. Now, bearing in mind what is happening on the continent, the interests from China, the appetite from Russia, and such good statements from the Americans, should the continent smile, or should we be more worried about this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if I may just add, just make sure there's a question mark in what you say. Thank you very much. One there. And we need one more. Sure. Okay. It is on. Yeah, go ahead.
So my name is Joy Ofora with the Bellcrest Institute, and I picked up on Landry's submission that not all African countries have the same capacity when it comes to trade. So my question to you and anyone else who wants to take on is, how can African countries collaboratively address the trade barriers that we have and regulatory challenges to create a more efficient intercontinental trade environment? Okay. Thank you.
Great. Right next to you there, yeah, sure. And then we'll come back to you guys later. Yeah, over to you.
Mel Foote, Constituency for Africa. Thank you very much for the delightful report. I look forward to reading it. Foresight Africa 2024. I don't see you talking about the U.S. political year that we're having. Do you really expect the U.S. to be engaged in Africa in 2024? President Biden did not go to Africa as he had promised, one indication. And also, I'm looking at the Sahel countries, and it seems to me the U.S. only had one tool in the toolkit, and that's a sledgehammer. Is there any way that we can modulate our response to be able to adjust to the realities of Africa? And finally, I didn't hear the diaspora mentioned one time in this conversation. Do we no longer matter?
Thank you very much. So let's, Peter, shall we start with U.S. engagement in an election year? And then, do you want to take the trade question that our sister over there mentioned? And then, and Landry can chip in as well. Yeah?
So the question is for Landry specifically.
For Landry, okay, sure. Okay,
I'm fine. You
yeah.
can take it.
Peter first.
Okay,
Peter,
thank you. Thank you. Well, I've been engaged in U.S. policy on Africa. I hate to admit how many years I've been engaged in it. I've learned in Africa. I've graduated to the elders table. But the fact is, one of the delightful things, I have to say, is that it's one of the few remaining areas of our foreign policy that is largely bipartisan. There's great congruence, great continuity, ever since President Clinton to President Bush to President Obama, from now President Biden, great continuity. There are changes in accents, in emphases, but it's largely been, look at how AGOA, the African Growth Opportunity Act, has been renewed almost without opposition in the past. Programs like PEPFAR and the creation of the Development Finance Corporation, there are challenges. So I would say there's great continuity. And in that, I am hopeful that the continuity continues. For example, initiatives like the strategic corridors. Whether or not there's a change of administration a year from now, I don't see that changing. No. So in that sense, continuity is a good thing. Comity is a good thing. That doesn't mean that things can't be politicized. That doesn't mean that there aren't risks that need to be factored in. But I'm hopeful that what we've managed to do for years continues. And a lot of it depends on support from people like you, Mel, and others who've managed to keep Africa on the attention of policymakers at a sufficient level, but at the same time, been always open to working with both sides of the aisle, and that's the key, and that's what African governments need to do as well. I would, back to my earlier point about security, is engage, be prepared, and don't be caught flat-footed if there's change or if there's continuity. Yeah. The key thing is being engaged with that process.
Yeah. There was also a question that ended with a question mark, Landry, where he said, the diaspora, do we still matter?
Do we?
Thank you for the question. So, of course, when our big boss, Brahima Coulibaly, Vice President, I know that we are having a broader conversation about the U.S. electoral year. And one of the key points which was highlighted as part of my contribution is related to the role US-Africa relations, but in particular with an angle of the diaspora. So we think about it, the diaspora is extremely important as framing both the dynamics within the US, but also of US-Africa relations. So that is a point that you are, so you will hear a lot about this point during the year. And
there was also a trade question next. Sorry.
And on the trade question as well, of course, numerous protocols were already adopted. For example, with the African Continental Free Trade Area, whether we mention the one on intellectual property rights, the one also on investment, competition policies, some are very close. So whether you speak about on youth and women, and rarely those protocols or the conversions at the continental level doesn't prevent the local and national policymaker to build capacity. It's extremely important to build capacity, because one of the reasons, and that is not just a local issue on the continent, but it's also a continental issue at the global sphere. One of the reasons why African countries have fewer cases with the World Trade Organization is simply because there's not enough lawyer and enough continental capacity to bring the case and to sustain them given the length of the trials. So those national capacity, and I know for having discussed that the AFCFTA Secretary General and team are working on building that capacity with specific programs, including for youth, for women, and including of young graduates from Africa who can come and spend a year at the Secretariat in Accra.
Okay, we will come back again to, I think there was a question over there about the linkages between the continent. Do you want to take that, or Zainabu, any of the Zainabus?
I think it was a question on the interest, the various parts of the world that are now interested in Africa, and whether Africa should be happy or be worried.
Yes, cautious about.
Okay,
Take it, my sister.
Others can also chip in. So that's a very good way to frame the question. It's also, you know, there's a binary there that I don't think necessarily needs to exist. The reality is, you know, in our highly globalized and interconnected world, no country is, or no part of the world is gonna grow and develop in an isolated manner. You know, autarky is a thing of, I don't know, the Middle Ages. So different parts of the world would want to engage with Africa for a whole range of reasons. In fact, beyond the countries that you mentioned, even global multinationals now have Africa strategies. Then the question is, what are the strategies of African countries towards the rest of the world? Do they have desks in their ministries of foreign affairs or ministries of finance to be able to understand who their major trade partners are? And that's why I started off my remarks with the comment on trade. Again, you know, sorry, I'm a bit pessimistic here, but a lot of countries don't even have a sense of who their main trade partners are and how this is changing. So do they know that? Do they know who their main trade partners are and how this is changing very, very quickly, and the impact on their economies and their societies if they're no longer able to earn foreign exchange? And then the global multinational companies, et cetera. So overall, what is the strategy of African countries towards the US, towards China, towards the EU, towards Italy, towards, you know, Romania also has an Africa strategy. All of these countries, all of these companies, I think that should be the critical question, I would say.
Right. Thank you. I think we'll come back to you guys. We'll do another round of questions very quickly. Thank you very, very much. Peter, on governance, you wrote a brilliant piece for us in this year's Foresight, and I'll encourage you to read that piece. What struck me was the statement, the picture you painted, that one can now literally travel eastwards across the African continent, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean, without setting foot in a country with an elected civilian government. That really is vivid, right? So how do you explain the democratic backsliding and what can be done about it?
Well, the way I would answer that, and thank you for the question, Aloysius, in order to backslide, and I'm not minimizing the effects of what we thought we had put behind us with men in uniform seizing power in days of our youth, I'm not minimizing it, but in order to say it's backsliding, the presumption is there was democratic governance beforehand. And let's face it, we've all gotten very lazy, and that is a collective responsibility of, first and foremost, African institutions and leaders, but really globally, where we've taken this shortcut, this cop-out of, there's an election-like event, to quote my dear friend, Ambassador John Campbell, and then we proclaim the result of that a democracy, and therefore a coup against that is a coup against. Now, I'm not favoring coups, but was that really an election? Was that really democratic governance? And if the answer is negative to either or both of them, are you really backsliding, or are you just sinking more into the mire that you're in? So we have to look at what came before. And the key thing in question is looking at legitimacy. And when I was U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel, the one drumbeat I beat again and again, I had to actually fight an internal battle within the State Department to let me use the words state legitimacy, because I wanted to raise that issue. Is the state the imported state, the leftover from the last bit of colonial legacy, or is it something that really provides goods, services, and legitimacy to people? So not minimizing the negative trends, but I argue we have to emphasize that aspect and really take a close look in the mirror as to what we're having, because that's the ultimate source both of future growth and opportunity, is development and governance that's centered on people. And there you have, from that will grow stability, democracy, and everything else that we have to have. And that's why the governance piece is a critical component of the future.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to turn to you, Kalpana, because one of the pieces in this year's report is on credit ratings. We had a very, very phenomenal event here in the last spring meetings with African finance ministers and central bank governors. And the UNDP just put out this report estimating that subjectivity in credit rating costs Africa $75 billion. That's a lot of money. In fact, it's 90% of what you need to eradicate malaria. And so I remember you and I exchanged, in her brilliant piece, Poonam Gupta, who also confirmed that the Indian government is livid about the cost, the exorbitant cost of credit rating. What's your view of what needs to be done to make credit rating more objective and fairer for African countries and indeed for the emerging market countries?
So just let me start on a slightly lighthearted note. President Obama also chastised the credit rating agencies when the U.S. was downgraded. So just saying, I think everybody's it's their favorite whipping point. But on a much, much more serious note, first of all, there are two issues. Africa faces a much higher cost of capital and much lower credit ratings. They're not disconnected. As you were saying, Zainabu, earlier about how they've not only has debt gone up, but the share of private market credit, private market debt in Africa has shot up in this past decade. So credit ratings and credit rating agencies, maybe 10, 15 years ago didn't really matter much for Africa. There were one or two countries that had market access. Now a lot more countries have market access, so their views matter. It is also the case that of all the downgrades that took place since the COVID-19 pandemic, the majority, something like 90% of the downgrades happened in developing countries, and that 40% were was in sub-Saharan Africa. You might say there were bigger downgrades in these low-income countries than in the high-income countries, where arguably the economic impacts might have even actually been larger in some of the high-income countries. And then the immediate impact of these downgrades has been absolutely profound. In Africa, you have, we've talked about the countries that went into default, the ones that are, I admit, I agree with you that the situation is improving in the common framework, but it is still horribly slow. And the people who are paying the price are the people who had nothing to do with the decision to incur the debt. But anyway, so it has been profound, and so this is a material question, is the point I'm trying to make. But I think one of the things that people are still struggling with, and there's been good research done, my former employer, IMF, UNECA, UNDP. UNDP finds is slightly different from the other two, that says, is there subjectivity? And they throw in, of course, those of you who've done regressions know you can almost explain or not explain anything. But
you can try.
But with that caveat, let me just say, they do find, with some of the most careful work that I've seen, that there isn't evidence of a huge amount of subjectivity in this analysis, although there is still an unexplained component. So one thing is we can continue doing the analytical work to try and understand what's going on. And if that's what interests people, they should go for it. From my point of view, I think what needs to be done is not running more analysis to figure out what's going on. We already know that we need two types of transparency. We need transparency on the part of African countries on data, on what's going on, good, high-quality data that's put out on regular intervals and without too many delays. But we also need transparency on the part of the credit rating agencies. And that's something that we, as a foundation, are pushing on and will continue to push on. The second is, we've talked about, I started out saying this is the time for them to grasp the bull by the horns on policy reforms. The Foresight report talks about domestic revenue mobilization. You talked about domestic revenue mobilization. The ironical thing is when countries are able to raise their own revenues is when they're also able to access markets at cheaper rates and so on and so forth. So that is an imperative that they need to grasp right now. There's no mystery about what policies work to raise revenues. There's no mystery about what administration reforms need to take place. It just needs to happen. So Landry, as you were saying, sort of get on with it, right, in a way. The third thing, of course, is the IMF and the World Bank, I think, can be a lot more forward-leaning on putting out the debt sustainability analysis and so on earlier in the process. And one final point, I know there's been discussion of, well, we should disregard these credit rating agencies and create an African credit rating agency. Fine. That's good, but it only matters if investors actually look at what the African credit rating agency is doing in order to make their decisions. Those countries, including my own, that have their own credit rating agencies, they are invaluable for domestic investors. And so if it's a part of a domestic capital market development strategy, yes. If it's a solution to the big three credit rating agencies, not so much.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Zainab, we talked a lot about IDA, replenishment, etc., money. When Wolfenson came as president, it was quite clear that his vision was impact on the ground, development effectiveness. Now you have a new president. Is there an agenda for Africa, for development effectiveness in Africa by the World Bank?
So first off, our new president, Ajay Banga, came and immediately moved from the double goal to a triple goal. And the triple goal is ending poverty, boosting shared prosperity on a livable planet. So it's poverty, prosperity, planet, triple goal. So only on the goal, more ambition. Second, when we think about the point that 2/3 of the extreme poor are in Africa, when we think about the fact that 50% of the future poor will be in FCV country, you cannot achieve these goals without Africa. Africa is central to the mission of the bank, whether it's a double mission or a triple mission. But he came also with renewed ambition and vigor to really say how, as a development institution, can we be further challenged. And at the level of operations where we are working, it comes in three things. Better, bolder, bigger bank, hopefully. We talked about IDA, but it doesn't limit itself to IDA. But on the better and bolder bank, you think about it in three ways. One, it's speed. It is taking way too long to get to impact, the problem about impact. How can you speed it up? In COP, he announced reducing the time for us to prepare a project by 1/3, but the next step is to implement it much faster.
Yeah.
The second point is about scale. We have to really get to scale. An example of that is our sister Victoria Kwakwa is working in Africa East at a project that is gearing to really close the energy access gap in Africa by 1/3. That is amazing. We're talking about 100 million people getting energy access, number one, through renewable. Number two, this can be expanded to another 125 million people. Just in the East, we're talking about 25 countries, 225 million people. In the East, in the West, if you add another 100 million, for a gap that is 600 million, that is scale. How can we do more projects that get to scale? But to get to scale, you cannot just do it with our money. You have to think about domestic resource mobilization. You have to think about the private sector. What would it take? As an institution, we have MIGA that is providing guarantees for political risk, which we've established are really big. We're talking about IFC that is really gearing to the private sector. How can we be one World Bank group and including also ICSID so that we really bring that might to do that? Last point is about impact. Impact is also about building client capacity. It's not about us. It's about the processes. It's about the overall infrastructure. It's about think tank. It's about university. So how do we push on that side, really helping build system and taking measured risk to do that? So that's a big effort, but to me, it's about a change of mindset, about how do you do development, but also about the operating and the delivery model, including in fragile state. So super excited about that.
No, thank you. Thank you very, very much. I wish we had more time because many of these subjects demand more time. I'd like to fit in a couple of questions before we wrap up. And Zainab, I know that you're a big fan of critical minerals, and our continent is well endowed with critical minerals, vital for the energy transition we talked about, and clean energy technologies. Very, very briefly, what should African governments do to capitalize on the advantage and create jobs and reduce poverty?
Sure. A very pertinent question. I don't know if I'm a fan of critical minerals, but I am interested, very, very interested. But a lot of my work is really how African countries can utilize their natural resources to achieve economic and sustainable development, whether it's minerals or oil and gas. And what is interesting is you tend to see these swings every, 10, 15 years between like a global focus on oil and gas or minerals. So we're now in the minerals phase. Oil and gas is not cool. It's going to be hopefully phased out, but we're going to see a swing again at some point is what I sense. But with respect to minerals, now that it's the topic of the day, so to speak, there are at least 20 mineral-rich countries in Africa, depending on how you define it, that rely on the export of minerals for at least 25% of their total exports. And it has been an age-old question. How do they maximize the benefits of these natural resources? It's not something that started today. So in a sense now, thinking about how to capitalize on this global demand for minerals that are essential to the low-carbon transition is, in a sense, repackaging an old question that countries have been grappling with since the post-independence era. How do you achieve industrialization, beneficiation, through beneficiation, through value addition, jobs creation, as was mentioned earlier. And the experience really has not been that great for a lot of African countries. Think about conflicts, you think about environmental and social impacts, etc. So 3 quick things I'll mention here. I think the first is that there needs to be an ambitious yes, but pragmatic approach to resource-based industrialization. So absolutely right now, the focus for a lot of African countries, if you go to any discussion on minerals or natural resources, they'll keep mentioning value addition. We want to add value to our natural resources. And in fact, some countries have imposed export bans on the export of unprocessed specific commodities, lithium in particular. I don't want to mention any countries, you can look this up. So that is an interesting starting point, but export bans just don't result in, you know, industrialization, create the backward linkages, the jobs creation, the connection to different industries in the economy. You need to do the hard work of thinking about what market are you trying to target, and then what specific aspect of value addition you want to develop a strategy around. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think learning from failures of the past in terms of value addition will be essential. And one key reason for a lot of the failure of some of the import substitution industrialization policies that African countries had with respect to particularly minerals, but other sectors of their economies, was that there wasn't a clear understanding of the market that they were targeting. Trying to do import substitution, but with a very small domestic market, it's not going to work, right? So thinking really about the market, and then therefore having a more integrated and integrative approach to policy making, where you combine trade policy with investment policy, with you know, a specific mineral strategy, but also something that was mentioned earlier about data. So, you know, there's this common statistic number that is thrown about. Africa possesses 30% of the world's critical minerals. Says who? We don't know. We actually don't even know, you know, what exactly is under the soil in a lot of African countries. The geological surveys, where they exist in some countries, actually in Cyrillic, that's the Russian script. They were done during the time of the Soviet Union, right? So with new technologies, we need new geological surveys. So we need a more integrative approach to policy making. And finally, kind of circling back, because we're in Washington, D.C., there needs to be a productive and a dynamic approach to partnerships with different parts of the world. Because, you know, the demand for these minerals is coming from outside the continent, a lot of it. You know, the industries around clean energy technology, solar panels, wind turbines that require these minerals as input, a lot of them are not really located in Africa. Sure, we need to see how we can localize some of these industries in Africa, but the demand is coming from elsewhere. So partnerships with parts of the world that have the demand for these minerals is going to be essential. And specifically with reference to the United States, now the US wants to build its own domestic clean energy industry, trying to diversify the supply chains and the sources of the critical mineral inputs. Africa can be a strategic partner here, all right? And thinking about how do we expand this trade in minerals and metals between the US and Africa, what instruments to use, how to attract investments from the US private sector in processing on the continent, processing of minerals, is going to be essential.
Right, thank you very much. I know that we're out of time, but I'm going to use the prerogative of the chair to ask one more question of the panel. It'd be unfair to not ask Landry a question on digital economy, which is its area of comparative advantage. We have heard from your piece that there is you know, a lot of talk about the potential of digital technologies transforming our continent. And you also talk about the digital divide in that piece with Harun. I was just wondering if you could share with us, what can governments and the private sector entities do to leverage these technologies and to bridge the digital divide?
Thank you so much, Aloysius. In the interest of time, I'll be very brief, especially as my book, Unlocking Africa Potential, but also Africa's Fourth Industrial Revolution, which synthesize many of my ideas on the question, is available just at the Brookings bookstore. So allow me to respect the time and to only have a few words. But one thing which is really critical when people hear about innovation, technology, the fourth industrial revolution, and so on, they think about tech, where it is much more complex. In fact, some of the characteristics of the fourth industrial revolution include the velocity, the incredible speed. A few centuries ago, it took about 100 years or a few decades for a technology to be developed and be broadly adopted. Now, it's a matter of months, if not even days, if we think about ChatGPT and how it evolved. We were just celebrating its first year not a long time ago, but it's already one of the most influential tools, disrupting everything as we know it. So that's one of the dimensions. The second, also the scope. All the sectors are affected. You cannot be out. Even if you are out, you are in. In fact, that just means that you are left behind. And then the system impact. So the approach really, whether we speak about healthcare, government, the primary sector, extractive industries, secondary sector, tertiary sector, all the sectors are affected holistically. So it is therefore extremely important for African countries, but also for the private sector, to think holistically. And people will typically, or scholars will typically discuss about a couple of types of approaches. One is the design approach, looking at a specific challenge which need to be fixed and focusing the effort on addressing that specific challenge. For example, in Rwanda, given the infrastructure challenges, drones were used to deliver medication and medical material in remote areas. As a matter of fact, people may not know, Rwanda has pioneered globally agile governance for the use of drone for those type of settings. The Californian company which was developing the innovation was not able to operate in California. It's after the successful experience in Rwanda that the innovation was therefore disseminated in many other countries, whether in Africa, in Asia, in North America, among others. So focusing on the human capital is key. So you need the capacity. Focusing on physical and digital capital. So if you have the human capital but you don't have infrastructure, you will not make much progress. Focusing also on perception. Sometimes technology available, infrastructure are there, but people may not have the mindset of using them. Focusing about agility, the enabling environment. So those are really some of the key dimensions, and ultimately tech. Focusing on the tech and on the innovation capital. All this put together will help address a couple of key challenges related to technology. The velocity, so the pace challenge, the speed between innovation and adoption, and the coordination challenge. I will stop there. The book is out there.
Please, thank you. Thank you very much. And I think there are just so many questions from online we didn't get a chance to get to. Many hands here we didn't get to. But I wanted to close by basically saying a couple of things. One, we have a series of launch events where we will take some of the thematic aspects of this report in this forum, in the next couple of weeks and months. Please watch out and join us in those conversations. And secondly, we talked about 77 authors in this report. We are launching the third season of our podcast series, which is also titled Foresight Africa Podcast, which you will see on the Brookings platform. And it's an opportunity to engage all these authors who have written such brilliant contributions to this year's Foresight. So please watch out for that. But for today, I'd like you to join me in thanking our esteemed panelists. Thank you for coming, and of course those who joined us online. Sorry we didn't get to your questions, but we'll make sure of that in the next season. Thank you very much.